Hyperia is a Mack Rides hypercoaster that opened at Thorpe Park on the 24th of May 2024 as the UK's tallest roller coaster, taking the record from the big one at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Upon opening, it was branded by many as a world-class roller coaster that simply blows every other UK ride out the water. However, over time, the ride has suffered numerous technical issues and setbacks that have ultimately led to what many people claim to be a negative impact on the experience. Consequently, many enthusiasts have now redacted their previous claims and now report the ride to be an unpleasant and somewhat rough experience that barely makes their top 5 UK coasters. Now, up until recently, I hadn't actually visited Thorpe Park in 2025. However, that all changed last Friday on the 15th of August 2025, and as a result I've now ridden Hyperia since these claims started to be made, so I thought, why not come on here and share my perspective on this all. Is Hyperia a bad ride in 2025? Is it as bad as people claim it to be? And what amendments could Thorpe Park and Mack Rides make in the future to improve the ride experience? However, before we get into that, I think it's only right that I give you a bit of a history lesson on Hyperia's operation, just to clarify why the ride has got to its current state, why people are claiming it to be so rough and uncomfortable when that wasn't an issue initially. So as I mentioned at the start of the video, Hyperia opened on Friday the 24th of May 2024 to a great reception, and it operated pretty well throughout that day with minimal downtime. However, a day later, on Saturday the 25th of May 2024, the ride didn't open in the morning, and Thorpe Park released a statement essentially apologising to everyone. They also published a reopening date for the ride in the next week, and it seemed that there were some issues with the lift hill and the drive tyres at the bottom. The drive tyres are essentially just after the outer bank turn that the ride goes around at the start of the layout, just to help it connect onto the lift hill, give it that bit of extra speed essentially. So there was some sort of electrical issue going on essentially that meant that the trains were getting stuck on the lift hill. Now, unfortunately, the park were unable to get the ride ready for the initial reopening date that they had proposed. However, the ride did eventually open again on Wednesday the 12th of June, just under 3 weeks later. Now, going forwards, the ride did face a little bit more downtime due to issues with the drive tyres and the lift hill. However, that seems to have since now all been resolved. A bigger issue, however, that followed was the ride valleying. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, the term valleying essentially refers to on a roller coaster where a train fails to manoeuvre an element and gets stuck in the middle of the course of a ride. So in the case of Hyperia, we're referring to a train that's leaving the top of the lift hill towards the start of the ride, so it's got gravity to push it along, but it isn't making it to the final brake run and back into the station. Now, a week later, after its reopening, on Wednesday the 19th of June 2024, Hyperia valeted at the outer bank turn, which I believe is known as the Cremar roll or something like that, the huge, ridiculous outer bank at the far end of the ride. The train failed to get up that, and it was actually an empty test train that fell victim to this during morning testing. Now, as a result, the ride closed and the train was lifted off by a crane, deassembled and then reassembled. The ride reopened again a couple of days later on one train because the valley train was still in bits, and then shortly after that was put back onto 2 trains, and procedures were subsequently implemented basically to require that Hyperia's test trains are always sent round with a bit of weight in them, water dummies. Now, on roller coasters, weight helps to ensure the trains can maintain a little bit more speed and therefore reduce the chances of valleying. However, this unfortunately didn't seem to solve the issue, as yet again on Wednesday the 2nd of October 2024, just a few months later, the ride valleyed once again on the outer bank turn. This time the train was full with some water dummies. I don't believe every seat was occupied though, and consequently it remained closed for the rest of that day, opening the next day on the 3rd of October on one train, obviously the train that didn't valley, and then it was back on 2 trains again a few days later. Now, following this, Hyperia operated successfully for the remainder of the 2024 season. However, this wasn't the end of the issues for the ride, as the train actually valleyed a 3rd time in the space of 12 months on Wednesday the 2nd of April 2025. Now, the specific details of what exactly happened here aren't quite clear, but what we do know is that The ride was operating as normal, so this didn't happen during morning testing this time. However, a wind alarm was raised because there was high winds that day and they'd exceeded what the ride could tolerate. So the operators essentially took the ride down, they offloaded guests, but following this they actually sent an empty test train round the ride. God knows why this wasn't filled with dummies, as was specified should be done in the previous procedure that was implemented last year. And yet again, the ride valied on the same place at the Outer Bank while people were stood in the queue. Now, the footage of this happening was actually filmed by a theme park Instagrammer and YouTuber, shout out theme parks and attractions, but reportedly apparently staff and security etc were shouting at guests to get out the queue because obviously they didn't want this going all online. So this YouTuber essentially just filmed the footage and left, and then apparently came back a few hours later to film a bit of an update on the ride. Apparently was surrounded by staff and the manager came over, got involved, etc, and was essentially threatened because they'd filmed this footage. Now, this is terrible customer service by Thorpe Park. He actually made a video explaining in more detail everything what happened, so I'll definitely recommend you go and check that out. The park should not be taking this out on guests whatsoever. A roller coaster should not be valeting 3 times in the space of 12 months. This isn't normal. They should have some accountability and be getting onto Mack rides to sort out these issues. So absolutely disgraceful behaviour from these staff. I think and I hope that they lose the jobs or just something happens. And, you know, just to annoy them a bit more, here's the footage that was filmed.
Well, I got the date wrong just now. It's actually rolling back Hyperia. Look at this. It's not making it over, just keeps rolling back. Good old Hyperia. Come on, Merlin, get some proper engineers in, get the Mack staff over here, sort this problem out because it's getting stupid now. It's been going on for a long time. It's supposed to be a world-class coaster. Come on, seriously.
Anyway, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. Now, since this incident, credit where credit's due, the park did take action to an extent. However, it's not the most ideal and complete action they could have taken, as I'm going to get onto. I do believe that they should still take further action in collaboration with Mack Rides to solve these issues. But what they've essentially done is they've replaced the regular wheels that Hyperia's running when it opened with some nylon low friction wheels. Now, these wheels, as I just alluded to, essentially reduce the friction with the trains on the track so that they run a little bit faster through the layout, and therefore the chances of them valleying is much lower. Now, in addition to this, the park actually installed some support braces underneath the seats on the ride. Now, I'm not entirely sure as to why they did this, but I can only presume that it was to accommodate for the extra forces that are obviously being exerted on the trains as a result of them running quicker, just to alleviate some of that stress. Now, this action, touch wood, seems to have resolved the issues with valleying, as the ride hasn't valleyed since. However, the ride reportedly following this got really, really rough. Much rougher than you would expect, or that a coaster that is 1 year old, manufactured by a company as prominent as Mack Rides should be. Apparently it was really uncomfortable, it was causing people headaches. Now, credit where credit's due to Thorpe Park, they listened to this feedback and actually somehow, some way managed to essentially remove these braces from the ride. I guess that maybe they queried it with Mack Rides and they came back essentially saying, yes, you can remove them. The extra forces being exerted on the trains with these nylon wheels obviously being in place are tolerable, essentially. They're not going to cause wear and tear. And that essentially brings us to today, where the trains are still running with nylon wheels, and since the removal of these braces, the ride has been reportedly much smoother. It's still rattling about a bit, but it's not unbearable. Which leads me on to answering the question, how did I find Hyperia when I rode it on the 15th of August? Now, there's 2 factors we've got to consider here. We've got the roughness that's been reported by enthusiasts following the installation of the wheels, and we've also got how is the ride riding, as it's obviously running faster now. Do any of the elements feel any different to how they did before? So starting off with the rattle, I didn't find this to be a problem whatsoever. I certainly wouldn't describe the ride as feeling rough. Yes, that rattle was there, it was noticeable. It was more noticeable than last season because, I mean, all Mack roller coasters have a little bit of a rattle, so even last season Hyperia was rattling a little bit, but in no way did it cause me any discomfort. It was more noticeable than any other Mack coaster I've ridden. So for example, Icon at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, that's an older roller coaster, but I can tell you now it does not rattle anywhere near as much as Hyperia does. Now in terms of the actual rattling where it was occurring on Hyperia, it was most noticeable on the valleys of the ride, particularly the valley between the Kramer roll, the outer bank where it keeps valleying, and the 0G stall. Now I managed to get 3 rides on Hyperia during my recent visit, and I rode it on row 10, row 6 and row 9. So I had a back row ride, a second to back row ride and a mid-train ride. Now personally, I found the rattle to be most noticeable on my first ride, so that was the back row, row 10 ride. However, that could be just because I was obviously looking out for it more, because that was my first ever ride on the coaster. I was a little bit nervous because I didn't know how it was going to ride at all, so I was really paying attention and bracing myself. I can only presume that the rattle is being caused by the trains running faster than they were obviously originally intended to run when the ride was being engineered. I think that's the most logical explanation, because obviously they don't have those braces under the seat anymore. It is something that the park and Mack rides ought to keep an eye on. However, I don't consider it to be a major issue for the time being. Now, as for the speed of the ride and how it feels in general, there's no noticeable difference up until you get to the 0G stall. Now, for those of you who are unaware of the elements on Hyperia, I strongly recommend you go and check out the review I released on this ride last year, just for a bit of background information. I'll put a link to it at the end of this video. But yeah, the stall is obviously the big loop element where you're hung upside down for ages, or at least you were before. Now, because the trains are running faster due to the reduced friction, which really starts to come into play here, the ride just takes that stall a lot quicker than it used to, and I'm afraid to say that it's kind of been killed. It doesn't feel like a stall anymore, and I was absolutely gutted when I rode this for the first time, to be honest, because that was definitely one of the highlights of the ride. Such an incredible element, but it just feels like a regular dive loop now. It's lost everything special that it had. Now, a 0G stall, I've ridden 2 of them. I've obviously ridden Hyperias and I've ridden 2 Tatuses. 2 Tatus obviously being an Intamin Blitz coaster at Park Asterix, so I'm well familiarised with how a stall's meant to feel. You're really meant to feel like you're being suspended upside down, absolutely hung there, pinned against that lap bar, and unfortunately, you just don't get that on Hyperia anymore. What it feels like now is you go up into that stall, and yeah, you get a little bit of floater air time upside down, but you barely can tell you're upside down for that long, if that makes sense. It's over and done within 1 to 2 seconds, whereas before it just felt like it was lasting forever. So unfortunately, it's just not the same as it used to be, that part of the ride. And just to demonstrate my point, here is a side-by-side comparison of how that stall rode before and after the nylon wheels were added. However, to compromise that a little bit, you do come into the trim brakes after that, and they still feel as powerful as ever. However, due to that reduced friction, you're obviously going a little bit faster when you hit those final 2 airtime hills. So that outer bank and the airtime hill into the brake run do feel a bit more punchy than they did before. That felt quite lackluster before, that part of the ride. However, it does have a little bit going for it now. However, it cannot replace that stall. And that leads me on to my overall verdict. Is Hyperia a bad ride in 2025? No, not at all. It's still a brilliant roller coaster. Definitely still the best in the UK, in my opinion. However, the gap between Icon and this, obviously Icon is also a Mack roller coaster, that's definitely been closed a little. It's safe to say that the ride isn't running to its full potential. It's not running how it was designed, because now they put those nylon wheels on there, which weren't originally intended to be put on the ride, obviously. That stall has just been killed. It doesn't feel like a stall anymore, and that bothers me, the fact that we're not getting to ride Hyperia as it was originally intended to its full potential. We're not getting the experience that Mack rides intended for us to have when they designed this coaster. And that translates to the thematic elements of the ride as well. It's clear the park just don't seem to care that much. They're not looking after it. Half the speakers going up the lift hill that are obviously synchronised with the train, they provide a really cool soundtrack, building the anticipation as you're going up. But at the bottom half of the lift hill, none of the speakers are working. And then as for the splashdown that's located where the trim brake is towards the end of the ride, that's barely worked since opening day, so it's just such a shame that Thorpe Park aren't giving the ride the love and attention it deserves. I think we really need to start asking the question now, how long is Hyperia going to be a special and iconic ride for the UK for? The park aren't looking after it, that's one thing, but we've also got to consider the fact that Universal Studios Great Britain, obviously the proposed theme park for 2031, it really does appear like in the planning documents for that we could be seeing a record-breaking roller coaster come there in terms of height. We've only got 6 years to wait for that if the project runs on time. So Hyperia could be losing its record very soon to a ride that, without a doubt, is going to be done to a much higher standards. Universal aren't going to be ones to cut corners in terms of costs. It's going to be much better themed, and I think it's just going to blow Hyperia out the water. Now, in terms of what I think that Thorpe Park and Mack rides should do going forward in an ideal world, well, first of all, believe it or not, every time Hyperia has valleyed, it's happened on a Wednesday. So maybe Thorpe Park should just choose not to operate the ride on a Wednesday. I don't know. Put a special Wednesday ticket out for a reduced price and put in the terms and conditions. Oh, by the way, Hyperia, we're not going to open it on Wednesdays because it always has problems then. But on a serious note, I think in terms of the issues that have gone on with the ride, both Mack Rides and Thorpe Park are to blame and should be accountable. Obviously, Mack Rides are the ones who designed and built this ride, so they've clearly gone wrong somewhere. But as for Thorpe Park and Merlin Entertainment, it's just so clear with how rushed this project was during construction and the lack of theming and stylisation. So many corners have clearly been cut in terms of costs. You know, they've clearly gone to Mack Rides and said, yeah, build us the UK's tallest roller coaster, put all these world's first elements on it. Well, that goes for the Cremo roll anyway, but even things like the Zero G stall are like out of this world elements that are still relatively new and innovative as far as the theme park industry goes. These elements were always obviously going to be prone to issues. Mack Rides have never designed elements of this scale before, and there's unique profiling, things like that, so there's always the chance of things to go wrong. But then even in response to that, Thorpe Park and Merlin, they clearly didn't put the money in over last winter to sort out the issues, like a coaster valleying twice within the space of a few months last year. That isn't normal. And then for that to happen again within 12 months this year, even more uncommon. Merlin have opted for what is essentially half a roller coaster. As amazing as Hyperia is, I still believe it is far too short. We could have had one of the best roller coasters in the world here if Merlin were prepared to spend a little bit more money. However, as usual, they settled for the bare minimum. Here we are, half a roller coaster that's really prone to breaking. I personally hope that Merlin take another look at this coaster over winter. I hope that they remove the nylon wheels so we get the Zero G stall riding how it was originally intended when Mack designed the ride. Now, there's a couple of other options that they could put in place to prevent the valleying, because obviously if they get rid of the nylon wheels, the risk of that happening is going to be increased drastically once again. Now, one option would be to install LSMs at the bottom valley before the outer bank where the train keeps grinding to a halt. Now, I was originally so adamant on social media and stuff that this is what should happen before I kind of gauged an understanding of how unrealistic this would be. Now, this could help solve the problem, don't get me wrong, you know, provide the train with a bit of extra speed if it's going too slow, so it can just about, you know, crest that outer bank and keep going. However, you've got to consider the fact that this would require drastic changes to the overall power sourcing for the ride. They'd probably need to put some extra power generators in, that sort of thing, cabling. The trains would probably need to be modified so that they can utilise LSMs, and it would just be a massive headache and potentially really, really expensive. Another option that would potentially be more realistic though, and that I'd like to see happen, is lowering of elements where the train is prone to valleying. And I'm referring to the Cremo roll here, the outer bank. Obviously, Mack Rides could potentially look to lower that by 10 to 15 foot, just so the train has that extra bit of speed, that extra 1 to 2 miles per hour, so that it can reliably make that element. Now, this has actually been done before on the Odyssey, which is a roller coaster at Fantasy Island in Skegness. That ride was really prone to Valiant, similar to Hyperia, in its first operational season. So in the off season, the park actually lowered a few of the elements on that, and I think that that'd be the most ideal situation for Hyperia, to make sure the train could continuously and reliably get over that outer bank, but that'd mean that we wouldn't need nylon wheels, so we'd also be able to have the 0G stall riding how it was intended. What do I actually think realistically Merlin will do though? To be honest, I doubt they'll do anything, because at the end of the day, they're not ones to spend money when they don't need to, are they? If the ride is running reliably with nylon wheels, they're just going to leave it. So unfortunately, I think we might just have to make do with the dive loop that was previously a 0G stall. Don't get me wrong, I'm still, regardless of how critical I've been in this video, really grateful that we have a ride at this calibre in the UK. Hyperia is still an amazing roller coaster that if you haven't ridden yet, you definitely need to get out and ride, because you will not be disappointed. And to hear more of the reason why you should go and ride it, why it is such a great ride, check out the video on the right side of your screen. It's my full in-depth review of Hyperia that I released last year. For more things theme park related in the UK and beyond, click the icon on the left side of your screen to subscribe to the channel. I'm Ben, you've been watching ThrillNet, and I'll catch you again soon.